So once you've got that Climate Change Act in place, the difficulty as well is that you create an inequality in government, because suddenly your plans to decarbonise are on a legislative footing, which means that people can sue you if you don't do enough. But there's no such plan for reducing the cost of energy. There's no such plan for growing the economy. So suddenly the whole of government is more interested in this one thing, which is decarbonising, than those things over there. And that's deeply problematic, because as we've seen at the moment, what's happening is the plans are to make electricity more expensive, to make it completely carbon-free, or almost completely carbon-free. And on the other side of the plans, also coming from the Climate Change Act, is to make people have electric heating and electric cars. So these two things are now pulling the complete opposite direction. You're going to make this electricity unbearably expensive, and you're going to have to force, through taxes and bans, people into cars and home heating that they simply can't afford. So our policy, which we've set out today, is we would scrap the Climate Change Act, because we think these top-down targets are actually, it's not working for climate change, it's not working for the economy, it's not working for industry, it's not working for households. And our primary focus on energy policy is to address the major problem the country has, which is the highest electricity prices in the world, and to make electricity cheap. We're going to do that unashamedly, make no apologies for that. But the extra bonus of that is, if you do want people to use electricity for their homes and their cars, this is a much better policy. You make electricity cheap, people will want to use electricity in their lives.
Because at the moment, I mean, this is one thing I was going to ask about. There's a sort of, we have this zero electric vehicle mandate where effectively we are forcing car companies to sell a certain proportion of their vehicles as electric, going up to about 80% by 2030. The problem is people do not want to buy them. So we are mandating our manufacturers to build and sell stuff people do not want to buy, and then finding them billions of pounds.
So I had the equivalent in my department, which was the boiler tax, which is the same thing for electric heating, and I refused to implement it. We had huge rows in the department. It was, I can see someone who I used to work with in the department, which I won't eyeball right now, but they will remember them very clearly. But we had this massive pushback. And from my perspective, I just thought it was mad, because we're saying that if you don't want this product, then we are going to charge you so much for a gas boiler that you'll be forced to buy it anyway. When have we ever done that in the history of time to make people adopt technologies, and has that had lasting political success? Not only that, you could see directly across in Germany that that kind of policy just blows up, because people really care about how they heat their homes. Of course they do. And government forcing you into it, as opposed to thinking about why it's not desirable and looking at the big picture, which is electricity is expensive in this country, is exactly the wrong way to go about it.
So, I mean, that sounds like the party is going to get rid of the zero electric vehicle mandate. Is that on the cards, or is that?
Well, yes, we've said we don't want top-down quotas. What we want to do is make electricity cheap. What you do with your electricity is up to you. But if you look at countries where, for example, electric vehicles or heat pumps have really taken off, it's generally where electricity is very cheap, because people go, great, I can save lots of money if I invest in this for either my home heating or my cars. I think that is a much, much more sensible approach than having targets which, as you say, are being missed.
So you say you're going to get rid of the party's moved away from net zero, you moved away from the Climate Change Act. So originally, there was originally a target to decarbonise to 80% of, was it 1990 levels?
Yeah, it's 1990.
And so the Climate Change Act, this is very boring, but the net zero, in fact, basically it's one line. And Rachel Reeves actually wrote it. Not a lot of people know that. And then the Tories picked it up. But so the net zero act is basically one line saying we will change the word 80 to 100. So is there going to be now any target at all for decarbonisation, or is it merely going to be something that we sort of hope happens?
Well, I think there's an important lesson there in picking up Rachel Reeves's policies, but I don't think the top-down target is working. You can make up these fake targets that you're never going to meet, and in terms of the Climate Change Act, that's a successful policy. But actually, if we make electricity cheap, you'll have a much greater success, I think, in actually reducing carbon. So instead of having top-down targets which don't work, we're actually going to have a policy of making sure that we're focusing on the underlying challenge.
But does that also apply to the various international treaty obligations we've signed up to? I mean, just the other day, Keir and Ed went along and sort of ratcheted up our obligations even further when everyone else was backing away politely.
Well, I mean, and that's a major problem because what they're doing is signing up to higher targets but not telling you what it's going to cost. Or they're signing up to higher climate aid, and some of that money will go to places like China. And just to give you an idea of the challenges that we have in the world, and this agenda is, we're 1% of emissions, we've halved our emissions. In that same time, China's emissions have gone up 300%. They're now 30% of global emissions. And they're the world's largest polluter by historical standards. So my view is, if you think about what's happened in the world, there's a very small group of countries which have done this to the extent that we have. Lots of people aren't doing it at all. Even if you're part of, say, the Paris Agreement, I think we're one of the only countries who are actually compliant with the Paris Agreement. So it's not working. And the smart thing to do when something isn't working is to say so and think about how else you could do things differently. And just to set out what our principles are, we've said, it's not that we don't care about climate change, but we think the way we're going about it is mad. We've got to change that. And the things that we're going to do is focus on innovation we could export. We're 1% of emissions, as I said. 99% are happening elsewhere and rising. If you can make something here and sell it to the rest of the world, that's good for growth. It's also good for decarbonisation of where the emissions are really being a huge problem. And secondly, we're going to focus on cheap electricity here. So I think that is a much, much more sensible agenda than having a network of targets across every single section of the economy that you can't meet.
So you've also said you're going to take away quite a lot of the taxes and the exchange trading, carbon prices, and that kind of thing. I mean, is that so? I mean, that would sort of put the UK out as on a sort of bit of an island in European terms, but presumably it's an island you're happy to be on because it makes us more competitive.
Well, I mean, what we're going to do, just to explain on electricity, is we set out plans today, which was to take off the carbon tax from electricity generation. And I don't think that does put us on an island, by the way, because we're one of the few countries in Europe which doesn't have coal in the system. And because we don't have coal in the system, we now just have a carbon tax, which is increasing the price of gas. Gas is about £55 a megawatt hour. The current price of electricity is roughly between 70 and 80 at the moment. And the carbon tax on gas is increasing its cost by 30%. That sets the price for a lot of other things. So it is just artificially inflating the price of electricity in this country. If you got rid of it, you would take about £8 billion off the total cost of electricity. Now, if you combine that with another policy, which is to get rid of some of the really, really, really high old wind subsidies that Ed brought in, we stopped bringing them in at a certain point in 2017, but they still get paid out. You could actually cut people's electricity bills by 20%, and you could do that tomorrow. It's in the gift of ministers. And I think that's really important because you've got someone like Ed Miliband who's promising people £300 off their bills. No idea when, no idea how. And on the other side, you've got Reform, who said they're going to take £1,000 off people's electricity bills. But do you know why that doesn't make any sense?
I do. Was anyone listening at all? No, it is because people pay less than £1,000 for their electricity.
The average bill is £850. So he's essentially saying, I'm going to give you electricity for free and then write you a cheque for £150. If you think that's credible, then I can't help you. But it's clearly nonsense. So for me, they're two sides of the same coin, both promising fantasy pledges they can't deliver. And actually ours it's real, it's funded, it's in the gift of ministers, and it would cut people's electricity bills by 20% tomorrow.
But you can understand how an average punter listening to this will think, well, Reform are promising to abolish net zero and save me loads of money. The Tories are promising to abolish net zero and save me loads of money. I'm going to go with the ones who didn't cost me loads of money when they were in power.
I mean, I think you can also look at the credibility of the plans as well. So Jeremy Corbyn would have won an election if people just followed that logic. I actually think people, particularly when it comes to costs of their energy bills and the fact they're so worried about it, do actually look at the credibility of plans. And with Reform, one of the things that you saw is at the beginning of the year they had a set of policies which was just a series of bans and taxes that they said was somehow going to lower bills. And now they've got this sort of fancy £1,000 pledge, and they've not put out a serious single energy policy. And any energy expert, even if they're extremely sort of net zero skeptic or wherever they might be, have said the same thing. And I do think that matters to people. I do think, as I said, like Jeremy Corbyn, he was promising, was it free broadband, free dental? It was all free, but people smelled a rat.
So you mentioned China earlier. I wanted to sort of probe you on something, because there's a sort of philosophical thing about conservatives and their attitude. If a container ship rolls up in Felixstowe Harbour with a load of dirt cheap Chinese electric vehicles, is your reaction, yay, great, cheap cars for British consumers? Or is it, boo, no, evil China, we shouldn't be taking so many of their products? I mean, Robert Jenrick on this stage yesterday said very clearly he considers China to be an enemy. And there's a lot of things that flow from that. I mean, some might even argue that China, that the Tory party has contributed to deindustrialising Britain, but China has certainly been pushing that along. So where do you sit on that spectrum?
So you can see, if you look at something like critical minerals, you can see that where people have tried to create supplies independent of China, take something like nickel, for example, what China has done is very aggressively dump nickel from mines that they've invested in to undercut that market. They are very clear that they want people to be reliant on them. They want to be the country that people can't say no to. We should worry about that. When you look at the sort of trade, the tariffs war that they were having with President Trump, one of the things they did in that was limit the exports of rare minerals. Now, we are increasingly becoming dependent on those critical minerals, and they dominate the supply chain. In some of them, it's 70%, 80% of the supply. We've just had a big crisis where the entirety of Europe has realized it had to wean itself off Russian oil and gas. We can't then become dependent on China for critical minerals. And I think that's the key thing. If someone is trying to make you reliant on them, you should understand why, and you should try and prevent that. So when it comes to dumping or whatever it might be, you should have to look at what industry are they trying to undermine and why. And actually a lot of the industry that they try to undermine are things which are critical that you might need in conflict, for example. So as a country, I do think we should have a steel-making capacity. I do think we should have some manufacturing capacity because you might need those things. And I think it would be very lax of government to let all of those things go and not think about how you might need to get them in the future if you couldn't get them from places like China.
So you support the nationalisation of Scunthorpe's steelworks?
I think there are certain industries that you would want to support because you cannot lose those capacities. I think that is important for a country.
So one thing you've spoken about, so in your speech you spoke about wind turbines and had a sort of nice analogy that Ed Miliband basically wants to swap a 4% variable for a 10% fixed because he's signing these contracts. You seem to be saying your preferred solution is nuclear. Is that right? That you're kind of going quite big on that?
Yes, and I think, look, just to give you some ideas of numbers, at the moment gas I talked about was £55 without carbon taxes. When Ed made that promise of cutting people's bills by £300, electricity was £72 a megawatt hour. The offshore wind that he bought last year was £82 a megawatt hour. And this year he said he's willing to pay up to £117 for that offshore wind. And you've got to remember, take that £117, it would probably come in a bit lower, but I don't think much because he said he's got to buy more than we've ever bought before, which is usually a pretty clear signal to the market. You've got to add in payments for the extra networks because you have to pay for more networks. You have to add in curtailment payments, which is when you pay wind farms to switch off when it's too windy. You have to add in potentially batteries in the summer to extend the amount of time that you would have solar for 4 hours. You have to put in long duration storage, which doesn't really exist yet, so we don't even know how much that costs. When you add up all of those costs, the true cost of that power is extraordinary. And one of the things that I did in the department was look at how we were costing energy. And it came pretty quickly because it was within 3 months I sort of said, we keep saying renewables are cheap, can you show me? And we went through all these spreadsheets and I said, well, this doesn't quite prove it. I went away, came back 6 weeks later and I was like, well, no, this doesn't quite prove it either. And I realized we didn't have a proper costing of energy in the Department for Energy. And so I commissioned a full systems cost, which is what you need, looking at all of those things. And Ed Miliband's cancelled it. And he's cancelled it because he knows it will look really expensive. And that's why I say now, if you want a cheaper energy pulse, you need base load. You need things which don't come with all these additional costs on top. And you need the cheapest form of base load in that system. Some of that will be gas, but gas prices at the moment are £55, as I said. And some of it, I think, will be nuclear, because if you look at nuclear build around the world, it doesn't need to be as expensive as it is here. And people are building nuclear at much lower rates, and those plants can last for 60 years. So I think that combination, having much more dominant a combination of nuclear and gas in our supply, would be much better for overall cost of electricity.
Yeah. So yesterday we just published a survey of 100 economists and thinkers.
Were you one of them?
I was going to say 99 plus me, 99 actual economists plus me, on what we needed, what we could do to unleash growth, and making it easier and cheaper to build power infrastructure, in particular nuclear, was like number 2 in the list after fixing our planning system, which is nightmarish. I mean, John Kay, in his book *The Truth About Markets*, said that Britain's the last time we embarked on a round of nuclear power construction, it was the single worst financial decision ever made by an advanced economy. To the point that it would have been, for the first 30 years, it would have been cheaper to shut it down and scrap it completely. It was just like the absolute case study of how badly Britain can do things. Given all that, how can you possibly say that we can do this more cheaply?
So firstly, we've set out some plans to make it easier to build nuclear already. If you look at the environment regs that we've got around nuclear, we've got some of the most stringent environment regs in the world. It means that at Hinkley Point C, we ended up spending millions of pounds building fish discos, which were acoustic deterrents for a small number of fish. Now, that is not happening anywhere in the world. It doesn't need to happen here. And more than anything, it's a criticism of a system which tries to make the planning system deliver every single priority of government. And actually, you forget sometimes the good in and of itself of that project that you're building. So with nuclear, for example, I would argue that you can relax your environmental regulations because nuclear is such a dense form of energy, it requires much less in terms of land. 3,000 times less land than solar, 1,000 times less than wind. That means just by fact of it being nuclear and that dense, you are carving up much less in terms of the environment. So to suddenly make it really hard and expensive to build nuclear, forcing people to build more wind and solar, is completely wrong-headed. And that's why we've laid amendments in the law to make it cheaper and easier to build. And you can tell that it's possible to build it more cheaply because you can just look at prices around the world. We have the highest nuclear build-out. That's partly because we hadn't built any for a long time. Stop-start approach is difficult. When we started Hinkley, there was one nuclear welder in Britain. That's not the case anymore, but we can do other things as well to reduce the cost. And like I said, the good thing about nuclear is it doesn't then come with all these additional costs on top.
So, I mean, a few more general questions. I mean, the party today has announced 47. So, effectively, as of today, as of this conference season, we are in a real sort of old-fashioned left versus right divide. That you have we have Labour and the Conservatives broadly agreeing that we're about 45 billion quid in the hole. Labour saying we can't possibly cut any spending, so we're going to have to do, especially not welfare spending, so we're going to have to cut that, do that all via tax rises. The Tories saying we're going to have to do that, we can't possibly tax anymore, so we're going to have to do that via spending cuts, in particular to working age welfare. No, zero on pensioner welfare, by the way, my pet hate. And then reform, I think their position is that they're going to both save hundreds of billions and spend hundreds of billions, and you'll end up in roughly the same position we were in. I mean, I mean, how is it that, I mean, we can discuss a lot about this, Robert, but how is it that the party can be promising 23 billion in working age welfare cuts, but not even dream, right outside there's a thing saying, hooray, congratulations, we've saved the winter fuel payment. Paul McCartney has got his bung from the Chancellor, thanks to the Conservative Party. Is that fiscal responsibility?
Well, I think there is a particular difference when it comes to sickness benefits at the moment, which is that we're completely out of line with other countries. And the question that you have to ask yourself, is it moral and right that you've got young people now, instead of wanting to go to work, asking themselves, am I going to get paid more in benefits? Now, I talk to businesses all the time, and I've directly heard that from multiple businesses who say, I've got a young person who started with us, who's an apprentice or is in their first job, and they've said, you know what, I might not stay because I think I can get more on benefits. And I actually think that's just a moral tragedy in and of itself. I also think you then get wider problems. If you talk about growth, the bits that government can do, making sure that infrastructure is easy to build, for example, not having the sludge of regulation and all of those things, the rest of it comes from people. And the important thing is that people feel a sense of agency. And what I worry about a lot at the moment is that I think there is an economics to resentment. And whether it's the amount we're spending on illegal immigrants, whether it's the amount that's being spent on people going on to sickness benefits. I think there's a lot of people who get up and work hard thinking, why should I do the extra hours? Or, you know, I might be thinking of starting a business, and then as soon as I start that business, I know that government's going to get in my way and I'm going to face this sludge of regulation. What's the point? And you see people just sort of lean back and not decide not to take those risks because they don't feel like the rewards are properly there. And I think that's a massive problem for a country. It completely changes your culture around work and work ethic. So that's why I think there's an added moral imperative to make sure that we're tackling that problem.
So you think it's an issue of fairness?
It's a massive issue of fairness, and I think it's a question of fairness, but it's also a question of aspiration. I think if you're teaching people to be less capable than they are, if the incentives of the system are to say, I couldn't possibly do whatever it might be because I've got anxiety and depression, and it's a mild form, and what the state is saying to me, well, if you've got those things, let's give you welfare and park you in your bedroom, then I think that's a massive problem for aspiration in society.
So there are a few seats at the front if anyone wants. Okay, no, he's found someone. But on fairness, sorry to push on this, but I'm trying to push everyone on it. How is it then fair to that you know to basically be guaranteeing an ever larger slice of the cake to people who are retired, who are in some cases poor, but in many other cases are the wealthiest cohort, one of the wealthiest cohorts this country, this planet has ever seen?
Well, I think the difference, like I said, is firstly, there's an international comparison with sickness benefits, which is out of line. I think there's a moral tragedy in people now deciding not to go, and this is increasingly young people not going into their first jobs. In some of that, fairness you talked about, I think having the national insurance rebate, saying you don't have to pay that national insurance for the first couple of years of your job, is a recognition that young people have a pretty hard start in life. And when it comes to pensioners, I think people on a fixed income who don't, for some of them, if you're 85 and you don't have the ability to go and then work and make up for it, I think it is a different thing to look at. And you saw with the winter fuel payment as well, it was very hard to target. That's why they got into such trouble. If they could just pick out Paul McCartney and take the winter fuel payment away from them.
Or Tony Blair.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone has their list. We shouldn't go round in a circle of people.
He's moving to Gaza, so...
Yes, but the point is, and like I saw this in the pandemic as well, it's very hard to do targeted benefits that go out to everyone because we don't know what people are worth. We don't have that collected in a list somewhere. And so what happened with the winter fuel payment is they thought they'd done it in a sort of clever way, but they'd obviously targeted 2/3 of pensioners and poverty. And for those people who are on fixed incomes, and that is incredibly difficult.
So on the politics, are you more worried about Labour or Reform?
Well, I worry about what Labour are doing right now to the energy system. The energy prices I talked to you about, they're up to £117 on offshore wind. Those contracts are for 20 years. So that's not just something you and I will be paying. That's something our kids will be paying. And I think that will be the PFI of the energy system if we let those go through. Bumper contracts, highest prices in decades for 20 years.
But Reform is to tear up the contracts. Is that something you'd...
Well, I don't know if that's entirely legally possible. So we would look at legal advice about that. But even if you did say you would do that, Richard Tice, when he promised, this is what I'm going to do, then walked it back in an interview immediately and said, no, what I mean by that is I wouldn't let them rebid in at higher prices if they wanted to, but they're already the highest prices in decades. So even at these prices, I think they're a disaster. And I think the most important thing is that they don't get signed. So we have until January. Anybody in this room who'd like to work with us, I think we really need to warn the public that this is what's coming down the tracks and this is what it's going to do to their bills. So I worry a lot about what Labour are going to do at the moment. And I do worry, Reform is high in the polls. We now have a sort of five-way politics that makes things very different. But what you'd have seen from us at this conference and the policies that we're setting out is this is not about an ideological tussle when it comes to sort of net zero and the Climate Change Act. Actually, what we want to do is talk about the problems that the country faces. I think electricity prices are really high. We've left the Climate Change Act so we can focus on that, and actually our policy is credible, it's real, it could happen tomorrow, and it will genuinely address the country's problem. The worry that I have about reform, and this isn't even as a Tory, just as a person in this country, is the public have already been in a cycle of people promising things that weren't delivered. It happened with us. We said we'd stop the boats. We didn't. It was an enormous failure, and I think it was a massive problem for public trust. Labour have said things like, we'll cut your bills by £300. They can't deliver that. Everybody knows that. You know, Reform are making promises, like I said, of cutting your bills by £1,000. You definitely can't deliver that. And I don't want that cycle to continue. I think if you keep going down that track, I mean, we're already at sort of rock bottom faith in politics. We can't go any lower. We need to start building it back up. And that's why I think it's really important that we are putting forward policies. I think the 100% business rates relief for retail, hospitality and leisure is something which would be crucial to the high streets. Cutting people's electricity bills by 20%, not on the never, never, not in the future, but now. I think us putting forward credible policies addressing the bigger problems that the country faces is really important.
Sure, but I mean, I just did Times Radio as a Sunday Times columnist. I hope you're all reading. And they had their regular focus group, and they'd asked them about Kemi Badenoch. And it wasn't that people hated Kemi Badenoch, it was that they didn't really know much about Kemi Badenoch, hadn't heard. It was like, just thought, basically the amount of attention anyone is paying to the Tories is pretty limited, both in the polls and in the media. The party that feels like it's being squeezed between Labour and Reform. So how do you get yourself heard for this sort of calm, sensible, rational policy? I mean, is it that you need to be on TikTok more and doing more videos of, you know, generic style videos of I don't know what the equivalent of going to the underground and catching fair dodgers would be, but isn't there a temptation just to sort of to find yourself shouting just to be heard?
Well, look, I think we are experiencing the same thing that lots of countries are, which is multi-way politics. And that's not just happening here. You're seeing that turn up in lots of different countries. And I think it is partly because if you look at what's happened in the West, you had the global financial crisis, and then you had the pandemic, and you've got sort of a very competitive Asia, and people have had a really tough time. And the important thing is I was going to say, that's part of why I think you've seen this fragmentation in politics. At the same time, you've got social media, which means that people are getting their news from much less traditional sources, and it's all very fragmented. So I have been doing some videos. I'm having great fun doing videos at the moment, because I do think it's really important to communicate with people in that way. But more importantly than that, we're not in politics as normal at the moment. We're in a death of consensus moment. There was a moment where for about 3 decades, politics, even between the parties, was not that wildly different. You know, there was globalization and free trade. There was sort of social liberalism, and there was not hugely divided, polarized societies in the way that you're seeing at the moment. But a combination of factors, that growth issue that I talked about, the fact that you've got social media and what that's doing to the shape of society, the fact that people are now very anxious, particularly I think about a growing decline in the West, has changed things. And I don't believe this is a politics of normal moment at all. I think this is a death of consensus moment where lots of things are about to change. And I don't think that this sort of snapshot in political time is going to hold for the next 4 years. I think a lot of things could happen, a lot of things could move around. One of the things that we could see is a serious borrowing crisis in this country. I think the risk of that is underestimated, and that could dramatically change things. I hope we don't, because as someone who was in markets during the Greek credit crisis and could see what happened to a country when they go through a major borrowing crisis, it is very ugly, but I fear that's where we're heading. Lots of things could change. And the thing that we need to do is, yes, losing an election is tough. It's awful. Losing an election and having looked at some of the things that you did and not being happy with it, it's a very tough place to be. But we have to do that. We have to do that charring of the soul and looking into all those problems that we got wrong so that we know we won't do them again. And actually, when we were in government, we did become, like everybody else, I think, a bit of a party of the noisy grasshoppers, where we were taking policies from these lobby groups and not really thinking through, does that agree with the silent majority? Is that part of our conservative principles? And if we don't do that hard work, then say something did come unstuck, I don't think we'd be in a good place to be able to present to the public the credible options that they need. And after all, that's what politics is about. We might not win every election, but our job is to put forward policies that can compete with other parties so that the public has a choice. And actually, at the moment, I think there is a group of people who do not have a choice, and they're the people who go and work hard. They want immigration solved. They want crime solved. They also want a strong economy. They want a serious economic plan. They want people to be pro-growth. They want to have a change in living standards. And I think that option has not been on the table for them, and that's what we have to provide.
Cool. Well, we'll open it up to questions from the audience after one more question, which is a slightly different topic. Chris, I read this out at a previous panel event. Apologies if you were there, but Christian Calgi of the Daily Express says the sheer amount of references to Margaret Thatcher in the exhibition hall is surely the sign of a party that is intellectually dying. There's a museum, 4 cardboard cutouts, her dresses, and her face on almost all of the Tory merchandise for sale. You would have no idea that the Tories had ever been in power past 1990 based on this room alone. Your thoughts on that?
Well, look, we're the Conservative Party. We celebrate tradition and heritage. I don't know who's been to see the outfits, but I know it will have brought many people joy. And for us, returning to history is not something that we shy away from. But of course, yes, we also need to think about the problems that we face. Now, some of the things that she faced that we face are similar. You had the inflation crisis. I think you had militant trade unions, for example. You had a sort of, again, that sort of sense of loss of agency that people were feeling, which I think was one of the great things that she managed to reinvigorate. But we've also got a whole set of different problems. I mean, I've had someone say to me today, I don't think Margaret Thatcher would have pulled out of the Climate Change Act. And, you know, that's the danger for us. I don't think just sort of ascribing lazily modern policies and the positions that could have been taken by her to her is the right thing to do. I think we need to think through the challenges from our own first principles.
Cool. Well, let's get some questions. And the hands are going up. Dylan and Sean, yeah, do you want to... well, let's start with the lady at the back and then the gentleman in front.
Is Nigel Farage a socialist?
Good question. And we'll take 2 at a time. And then...
Claire, the off-gen price cap, would you scrap it and let the market float?
2 very good questions. The second policy, incidentally, advocated by the CPS to pretty much no impact on your government or this one.
So firstly, look, I would look at anything that would cut bills. I've been very clear, my priority for this Parliament and the single thing that we need to do is cut the cost of energy in this country. If anybody here would like to talk to me about anything that they think could do that, I will talk to them, I will look at it. There is one focus for our energy policy. In terms of, what was the second question?
Is Nigel Farage a socialist?
So the problem with Nigel is you don't know what he actually thinks about economics. I don't know what he actually thinks, but I know the promises he's made. I know the people he's trying to win over, and usually that is the biggest tell. And what he said is he wants nationalisations that I know we can't afford. He wants more welfare, which will require more tax, and that will require more borrowing, and that just means more debt for our children. And if I think about one of the Conservative traditions is to think about legacy. It's important to me that we pass down an environment and a nature that we got to cherish and love. It's important to me that we pass down, an economy in good health which isn't saddled by mountains of debt. All of those things matter to us and our tradition, and I don't know what it means to him, but I don't think it matters in the same way to them.
Cool. And a couple more from this side.
Hi. Maurice Carr from CTM. There was some widespread criticism, or fairly widespread criticism, of your policy to ditch the Climate Change Action Act from business groups. So how do you take business groups on that journey where they have some policy certainty, especially around subsidies, which are sometimes on 15 to 20-year contracts?
Well, firstly, I would say that a subsidy regime which is creating huge costs for consumers that aren't being created in other countries will not give you certainty. Government might tell you that it's going to give you certainty, but eventually the public will get fed up and they will ask for change. And we saw that, for example, in Germany, where there was a policy around boilers. We actually saw it in Paris when they had a policy around homes. If you are forcing huge costs onto the consumer because of your policy, you will lose democratic consent. That is not a way to give certainty to business. The thing that government can do is look at landscapes and say, what can we do to improve your business landscape? I don't think that stringent targets which do not meet the requirements of the public to have a decent quality of life, to have decent jobs, actually have any certainty at all. All people will do is vote for another party, and actually you're seeing that across Europe.
The gentleman there. And
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Lady Thatcher was fighting because she was a woman, and it was the country had the first female leader. Now Kemi is going through a very difficult time because she's diversity. How proud should we be? The Conservative Party is changing for the better, has always, and the other parties can only dream. And we have the party that's given us many female prime ministers. The other parties have no hope of a female prime minister. So, as Conservatives, how proud are you of being with the change that we are going through, which is making our party the best party in the world?
Thank you. It's a question that I think is quite interesting, because obviously Keir Starmer, when he was up to be leader, was up against 4 women, and they obviously chose Keir. And they have a lot of conversations when it comes to the deputy leadership in Labour. They had a big thing, which was, this is time for a woman. I think, did one man say?
it has to be a northern woman as well.
It was a northern woman, and I think there was one man who sort of quietly put his hand up, and everyone sort of shot him down and said, this is not your moment. And actually, we've never done that. We've never said, you only, if you want to be leader, we must have a woman, so none of the men stand. We've never done that. And I think that's why we've had a succession of female leaders.
I actually lost quite a lot of money betting on the Labour leadership because I took them at their word when they said we probably need it's finally time for a woman leader. I was like, no, it's the white male lawyer from Islington. Oh, okay.
How much did you lose?
Not as much as I lost when Liz beat Rishi, because I'd bet on Rishi as next Prime Minister at 150 to 1 in 2019, and then she snuck. I mean, yeah. Of all the reasons to regret the Liz Truss interlude, mine is the...
So I think the important way to defeat inequality is to have a meritocracy. I mean, this is the whole point. I think this is where we've got so warped in the equality space, which is the other brief that I hold, is now the equality space is telling you to see the colour of someone's skin and act differently. And if you take a step back and think about it for a moment, you think, gosh, that is so backwards. And actually, I think one of the things the party generally does quite well, and I've always found, is it doesn't really look at you on the outside. It goes, well, what are the quality of your ideas? And I think that's probably why we have that difference.
A gentleman here has been once, and then 2 more down there.
Hello, thank you for coming and talking to us. I represent the Professional Association of Self-Caterers, and end of last year we saw 2 new interventions on EPCs. One was the new EPC methodology, and one was to introduce a much higher level of EPCs for long-term rentals and to involve short-term rentals in that. And the argument given was that it was to deal with fuel poverty. I can assure you, as a professional self-caterer, none of our guests suffer from fuel poverty when they come and stay with us, but we are also going to have to meet a level C within 2 years, if proposals go through, at a cost of £15,000 per property if you're not at C. Okay? That's 3 years' profit for a small business. This is a typical, what you refer to as a top-down, mandating that we need to use air source heat pumps and these kind of things. 75% of the stock is over 100 years old. The way that the EPC measurement will work will penalise us, and we'll lose 25% of the stock if it goes through. Will you oppose EPCs for short-term rentals, please?
Thank you. And can we just get a couple more questions there, because a lot of people want to ask questions, and I want to rattle through.
You talked earlier about the fact that ideally you would like to leverage net zero to drive growth in the UK and ideally sell products to the rest of the world as opposed to relying on China. I'm not entirely convinced the UK is at a point in innovation where we're seeing those types of products on the market and being able to become a leader. I'd love to get your views if you do see certain industries, technology sectors where you think the UK has an advantage, a competitive advantage, and where we might, where the government might want to essentially back them to become a leader versus China or even the EU or the US.
Cool. And just the guy next to you, just to, yeah.
Thank you very much. You talked about energy independence earlier, and you mentioned that you don't want to be dependent on Russian oil and gas, and you don't want a new situation where we're dependent on Chinese batteries and solar. So what does energy independence that's cost effective look like in your book by 2035?
Great. So on EPCs, I just think there's a fundamental principle that I have on poverty. And, you know, I worked with disadvantaged families since I was 16. And I think one of the reasons that made me a conservative is I think the thing that the left always wants to do is redistribute. So they'll tax someone over here and they'll try and give more money to the people that they think are at the bottom. And what they're doing alongside that, and this government is doing this, is raising the cost of childcare, of energy, of food, and of housing. So rather than confronting the fact that they're raising the costs of goods and services, they're just trying to move pieces of the pie around. And I think the conservative approach to poverty should be, primarily we want to reduce the costs of things in your life, and we should help you earn more. And I think somewhere along the line, maybe we lost focus on that. But that's one of the reasons that I'm so passionate about doing this brief, because I think it's one of the biggest problems that people face in terms of cost is their energy bills. So I will look at anything which is going to add cost to them and would happily look at that. But when we were doing the net zero reset, when I first came in, one of the things that we pushed back was minimum energy requirements because it was going to be passed on to renters. And it was not the right time to do that. So to your point on innovation, one of the focuses that net zero has had, because it is so myopically focused on domestic emissions, is about us being the early adopters of technology from other parts of the world. Now, I think that's a missed opportunity where 1% of emissions, 99% are happening elsewhere, and these emissions are rising whilst we've halved our emissions. So instead of spending hundreds of billions, again, in just us buying unproven technology from the rest of the world, what I think we should do is focus on being early creators. To your point, there is very few countries which have the innovation ecosystem that we do, maybe 4, 5. And us not leveraging that, I think, is a real missed opportunity. And there are various sectors that I've spoken to where you might not necessarily use the products here, but you could actually sell them. They would be more interesting to use elsewhere. But those companies never get to talk to government. So if you are a business that wants subsidy, generally government knows who you are. If you're a business that doesn't need any subsidy and can be profitable, you just maybe need a minor regulation change, it is like a brick wall. And I've met so many businesses who've told me that, and I saw it for myself as well, because I remember at points I'd be like, can you put together a roundtable of this industry? And it would just be everybody who wanted money from the government. And then you would go into the world and be like, oh, but there were all these other businesses, why don't we know about them? So I think we need to think much more about those businesses that want to export, but maybe are at the fringe of a certain sector and just need some rule changes or government to sort of understand what they're trying to do and work with them. The third question, what was your question?
Energy independence and security.
Energy independence. So you need baseload. We need to be using the North Sea. It's absolutely mad that we don't. Every country that I've ever met has thought that the policy to shut down the North Sea that Labour are pursuing is absolutely crazy. No other country is pursuing it. And when government says this basin is declining, we don't know that. We should never be telling industries.
The Norwegian take from the basin isn't declining.
No, they've had actually quite a number of fines this year, but we should never be telling an industry that we think you're declining, therefore we're going to shut you down. I think that's a totally mad thing for government to do. So that's part one. And for everyone who goes, oh, all the gas is sold abroad. No, it's not. The gas makes up 50% of our domestic gas supply. So let's get that straight. So I think that's one important thing. And at the moment, we are just buying back from Norway what we could be drilling ourselves. That is clearly nuts. Secondly, I think nuclear is really important. And again, we've talked a bit about how we would do that better. And to your point of innovation, SMRs, AMRs, one of the reasons that I had backed a facility here for AMR fuel, which is the next generation of nuclear fuel, is because we would be the only commercial producer of it outside of Russia. And that would have been an enormous innovation and commercial opportunity for us.
Some more from this side, if there are any. The gentleman there.
Thank you. So on this policy area and many others, of course, we're now trying to persuade the general public that we are further to the right of where they believe we are. How do we succeed in doing that, having spent the last 2 decades trying to persuade them that we're more further to the left than they think we are?
Thank you. Just back to gas, and we spoke in the environmental CEN next door about the fact that if you talk to Miliband or Chris Stark or anyone driving for Clean Power 2030, they would also say that that's going to drive down costs.
Get them a calculator.
I'd love to hear your actual take on the practicalities of that.
Fine. Okay, so in terms of, I don't think this is about, most normal people don't think in terms of left or right. They think, why am I in the system where if I want to do anything, there's all this sludge in my way in terms of regulation, taxes, whatever it might be. They think, why have I lost control of everything? Why does the system not respect family and community and nation? So I think you cannot do like any convincing overnight, but we need to understand who it is we're for and what are the policies that help them and what are our principles behind running the state. And we've talked a bit about some of those things today. And we just need to keep talking about that and making sure we're putting forward policies that sit within that framework and aren't just sort of all over the place. And so you mix all the colours together and you get brown, which I think is slightly where we were before. So I don't think it's a question of trying to convince people that you're right-wing. I think you have to genuinely believe a certain view of the world, which is pro-business. We've talked about being tough on immigration, tough on crime, so people feel secure, they feel respect for their nation, they feel love and pride in their nation, have a sense of agency and meritocracy. Do all of those things, and it will be a hard job, but then you have to keep communicating that to the public. In terms of, look, Ed will say that gas is the problem at the moment. Gas is £55. He's signing up to offshore wind up to £117. It clearly isn't the problem. And if he was just worried about cost, if that was his only concern, he could follow our policies. He could cut the carbon tax. He could scrap the ROC subsidies. He would cut electricity bills by 20%. If he really just cared about cost, he could do that.
So, and can I just plug here the CPS paper, The Great Grid Gamble, where we showed that, for example, the energy price, the report which said that Ed's plans would add up and wouldn't increase costs were based, for example, on taking the upper range of independent estimates for the gas price and treating it as the new central forecast. Ed's numbers effectively take a gas. They basically assume the Ukraine war carries on for the next 10 years, and gas prices are permanently elevated for the next 10 years. When independent forecasts, not least because of the sheer amount of refining capacity that's coming on stream in Dubai and America, independent forecasts have the gas price going down pretty.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. Like, even by their own standards, the numbers are very, very, very weak.
Even the IEA, the International Energy Agency, which is incredibly sort of pro-net zero to the point that I think, is gone too far, even they have gas prices falling. And the prices that DESIs are using, which I complained about at the time, are out of whack. And they add a carbon tax on top, which is the highest carbon tax in the world. Why? Wherefore? Why would government do this to its people? They cannot explain. And if you ask them why, they go, well, we don't recognise that number. So I think the idea that gas at the moment is the problem is just not true. And you can see that from the numbers.
The gentleman, well, we can just go along the aisle if you've got. Yeah. So,
would it help to rehabilitate the Conservative Party in the eyes of the public if we just fessed up and said we got it horribly, horribly wrong, the response to COVID, that we're not going down that path again?
And the gentleman behind you, and then the lady in front as well.
Yeah, very similar to what he said. Drill Baby Drill is a validation of people that were against climate change and global warming and the political climate at that time. And it was very similar to COVID, where there were a lot of people saying we shouldn't be locking down. It's going to, destroy the economy. And it's easy to have these policies when you're out of government. But when you're in government and some of these things come up, do you think the Conservative Party would evaluate properly and not just lean into one political side?
And then the lady at front, because I think this is possibly our last round of questions, isn't it?
Brilliant. Hi, Claire.
Hi.
Back again. You focus on electricity, or supply, energy supply, electricity. Fantastic to bring bills down by 20%. However, conservatism is also about conservation, and we should actually be looking at energy demand reduction. And this seems to be completely blended out of all the conversations nowadays. As our current trajectory with clean heat policy, the current policies we have, just putting heat pumps into homes, etc., we're looking at basically additional, about 150 billion additional electricity generation costs over 25 years. And this is because we're very siloed.
Can we get to the question?
Yep. So actually by widening and broadening and actually being sort of tech agnostic but including other areas such as insulation, you can actually reduce those costs by 300 billion. Will the Conservatives actually look at actually conserving our energy rather than just all about supply?
Okay, so one of the things that I think is not true is that we're going to need less energy. And actually the problem that we've had is DESNZ's planning for us to use lower energy consumption has actually meant that you have policies which are happening, which is to prevent energy consumption. So Sadiq Khan's London plan, for example, massively dissuades people from getting air conditioning. We are one of the countries in the world which has the lowest amount of aircon. You've also seen in recent weeks AI, which we know is very energy hungry, is being blocked or is facing challenges in this country because Ed Miliband is worried about how much energy it's going to use. And the thing I think we have to remember is that throughout the history of time, energy has meant prosperity. The more energy you have in a country, people use it and they innovate with it and they find exciting and wonderful things to do. So I think we need to be very wary of letting the machine run away with this idea that energy consumption is a bad thing. Now, if there are sensible things to do, you know, you've got sort of more efficient boilers than we used to, for example. I think that's one thing. But I think trying to infuse government policy with this idea that people shouldn't use energy leads to some very bad things. In terms of fessing up, yes, I do think we have to look at where we went wrong. Being in opposition is not just about scrutinising the government, it's also about scrutinising yourself. One of the things that I said today is that the 2019 net zero target and the Climate Change Act in 2008 shouldn't have sat on the statute books for so long. Kemi Badenoch was in Parliament when that 2019 bit was passed and was one of two people that spoke up. I wasn't there then, but I think it's important that we recognise what we've got wrong, and we have to be very honest and clear about that. To this other point about COVID and lockdowns, yes, I was very concerned about that. And
you were working with Rishi at the Treasury at the time.
Yes, and you know, this is one of the few moments in time where I made a massive stink across government and said I was going to quit and that I couldn't support a lockdown. And my Christmas card from Boris that year just said, "No more lockdowns. Merry Christmas." But I think it was a really worrying thing to do, and you can see the effects in young people now, and I think it was appalling. And as much as we got wrong in the pandemic, I sometimes look at lockdowns and think, thank God it was us in charge and not Labour, because Keir, every time we wanted to end a lockdown, attacked us. You know, the schools, when they shut for the first time, all of that was supported by the NEU, and if you think that we got it wrong, just think about what Labour would have done. But yes, absolutely, fessing up to the mistakes, making sure that we understand where we got wrong, where we went wrong, I think is crucial.
And on the final point about trust?
On trust, you know, it's I think one of the biggest issues whenever you lose elections. I think it's particularly important for us because we went through such an extraordinary period, whether it was global financial crisis, whether it was the pandemic, we were there at some of the worst times in people's lives. And whilst there are some things that I think we did do, which, you know, there was definitely good stuff in there, there was also some stuff that we got wrong. And one of the biggest things that we got wrong is I think we lost sight of our principles. And even where we were doing things well, there was no sense across government at certain points that this is what we think the state is for, this is how we think it should be run. And where it has been left, I would argue, if most people think about the state, it's big, it's remote, it's dysfunctional. And that's because we didn't have a set of principles saying it should be localised, it should be single purpose, and it should understand that people have relationships in their lives or other things in their lives, whether it's family or community, which are as important that we shouldn't try and tread on the toes of.
Thank you so much, Claire. So tomorrow at 12:30 in this space, we will have a debate on how we can make British energy cheaper with special guest star Ben Houchen. So if anyone is burning to have more energy in your lives, then that's the one for you. Next up in this space, I will be chairing a discussion on how to save the high street, which I'm sure the business rates measure that you refer to will come up. But for the moment, please join me in thanking Claire Coutinho.